Viewer discretion and listener discretion is advised. Stitches by A.G. Howard. Prologue. The first time the wrens sang at night was 3 years ago, when I used a rusty saw to cut off Pa's left foot. The birds drowned out his screams. Wrens don't normally sing after sunset, but I wasn't surprised by it. Birds are known as spirit carriers in mountain lore. When someone dies, birds of all kinds carry them back and forth between this world and the afterlife, so folk can keep watch over their living loved ones even after they're gone. I figured these wrens heard how loud Pa was wailing and gathered in expectation of a fresh delivery. At least 50 of them sat under the eaves of the slanted garden shed, my makeshift operating room. Dark skies folded around our mountain like a boy's hand covering an anthill. Regular folk would assume that the storm had driven the birds to seek shelter, but there'd never been anything regular about me or mine. My identical twin sister Clover and little brother Oakley weren't allowed to watch Pa's dismemberment. Even at age 13 and a half, Clover was too squeamish, and Oakley, being 7 years younger, was too tender. I'd left Clover in charge of things in our tiny cottage some 10 yards away. Upon my last look, they hunched in the farthest corner, a quilt wrapped tight around their heads, as they shivered at the thunder in the distance. Pa didn't scream long before he passed out. He was strong that way. A rock, Ma used to say. A rock that needed his edges filed. She was the only one who could tame his temper. When she disappeared on my and Clover's 13th birthday and Pa's drunken rampages spiraled out of control, it fell on me to file him down. By the time I turned 16, my surgical instruments and abilities had improved. I'd taken Pa's other foot and his eyes, his tongue and his ears, too. I soon came to realize that rain always accompanied dismembering days, as did the wrens. I suspected they were somehow tied to the collector, the boy who claimed the parts and gave us our cash. It seemed like both the weather and the birds knew when he was going to pay a visit. Or maybe it was the other way around, and they told him when it was time. Whatever the case, at the scent of rain and the rustle of feathers, I made the first cut, because I knew he was on his way. 1. Hollow Bones. We first met the collector when I was 13 and a half, the day after Pa drank 2 bottles of tequila and popped Clover so hard her front teeth fell into the chicken soup. When she fainted from shock and pain, I took over supper duty. I added some sage, the herb of my namesake, and boiled the broth on the stovetop without even fishing out Clover's incisors, letting the aroma of comfort and blood fill the air. There was a part of me that hoped that those teeth might come to life in Pa's belly and eat him from the inside out. Oakley hadn't grown big enough to merit any beatings yet, but by the next year, he'd be the age Clover and I were when we first encountered Pa's wrath. So while Pa guzzled a steaming bowlful, I imagined those incisors going to work on his innards. Pa ate every bit of dinner, leaving us nothing. He always ate like he was starving, but couldn't gain a pound. He'd never been a very stout man, and had become even thinner over the months since Ma's absence, frail and hollow-boned like a bird. But he was still as mean as a feral bobcat when he drank. He cussed at me till I handed off the keys. From the picture window, I watched him swerve down the dirt road in his Chevy truck, kicking up weeds and grass as the tires spun this way and that. Just before following the curve through the magnolia trees and vanishing from sight, he dipped his head out the window and spewed up his supper. I remember thinking what a waste of food that was, and that my high hopes for Clover's teeth had been for nothing. The sun set over the trees, bringing shadows to life. Pa was to be gone all night. My sister did her best to entertain us, despite the gray bruise that swelled her mouth and chin until it looked like a rotten plum. She insisted on making treats and having a slumber party. The inside of our cupboard and fridge had more cobwebs than food, but we always made do. Before our ma disappeared a few months earlier, she taught us how to make gingerbread without eggs and homemade cocoa using chocolate bars and water. I used to watch her hands as she stirred and folded and whipped, bending ingredients to her will. Those same hands that were rough from hours spent tending the garden, yet still had a soft touch when someone was hurt or sad. She always took off her bird-shaped wedding ring when she baked because she feared she'd get it dirty with the batter. I loved seeing the white imprint that her ring had rubbed onto her skin, like a dove tattooed above her knuckle. I tried not to think of how I missed Ma as Clover heated the cocoa and I stirred the gingerbread batter, then shaped it into perfect boys and girls to be baked. It was midsummer, and the old black stove heated the cottage till the stench of our sweaty bodies overpowered any discomfort we felt at being home alone. I forced down the gritty, spiced cookies and scalded my throat on overly sweet chocolate water without complaint. I figured by letting Clover ease our hurt, it would take the bite out of her throbbing lip and gums. With full bellies, we undressed to our skivvies and opened the windows to let in the cool evening scent of pines and mountain air. When it came time to sleep, Clover and I stripped the beds, tossing quilts and pillows on the floor beneath the picture window, and snuggled Oakley atop the pile to tell him stories. I started with Frankenstein. I'd always liked the idea of people giving up their parts to make a new person who could outshine them. Maybe I was too graphic about the blood and chopped limbs and cracking bones, because Clover got as green as the plant she's named after, and Oakley as stiff as a tree. Me? I was ready for dreamland. A shame my story scared Oakley so much. He moaned for more cocoa and a happy fairy tale before he would calm down enough to count stars and go to sleep. Clover, with the added charm of her fat-lipped lisp, told of a young princess who'd once been struck by lightning. She had auburn hair with a white blonde streak and blue eyes. This princess met a prince who swept her off her glass-slippered feet with a diamond ring shaped like a bird and promises of a happily ever after. He rescued her from slaving in a bakery in town infested with pastry-craving dragons and carried her to the mountains, where they lived in a cottage-shaped castle. Together they raised parakeets and fuzzy pot-bellied pigs to sell to pet stores. Since Oakley was only 6 when Ma disappeared, I don't know if he picked up on the similarities, but the cotton candy lies Clover wrapped around the truth made my mouth dry and my teeth ache as if I had cavities. In the fairy tale, the prince and princess lived forever without any woes. In the real version, the prince had tended to our animals while he was drunk out of his mind. He forgot to latch the chicken coops, and later that night, while he slept off his liquor, high winds rattled the coops till the gates fell open and all the hens escaped into the yard. An electrical storm scorched the sky and caught fire to the hog house. The hogs ran out in flames and trampled the chickens until they were singed, hollow-boned corpses. When the princess ran out to open the gates so the hogs could escape the spreading fire, she was struck by lightning, giving her another streak in her auburn hair and breaking something in her mind. She came into the cottage, screamed at the prince in some indecipherable tongue that failed to wake him, and then disappeared into the night. The heavens opened up a flood of rain that doused the fire, but it must have swallowed Ma, too, for she was never to be seen again. Hollow bones. They make a blood-curdling crunch when you step on them. It drops the soul right out of you, unless you like that sort of thing. And roasted pork doesn't smell nearly so appetizing when it's mixed with the funk of scorched feathers and beaks. Still, I dragged what was left of our hogs out of the bone pile, and we ate them anyway. With Ma gone the next morning and Pa vanishing to look for her without coming home for 2 days thereafter, we couldn't turn our noses up at free ham and bacon, no matter what was used to spice it. In Clover's fairy tale, the prince wouldn't have spiraled into even deeper rages after losing his princess and their one means of income. He would have found another way to make cash instead of taking odd jobs in town and then spending every penny on whiskey, tequila, and the occasional carton of eggs when a carton of cigarettes was too steep. I fell asleep after the storytelling ended that night, listening as a snore whistled through Clover's empty tooth sockets, wishing the prince of her fairy tale could someday be our Pa. In the years that followed, I came to understand why they say be careful what you wish for.